Hello and welcome to Jinnah Institute's latest webinar as part of an ongoing spotlight series on the three-day India-Pakistan border conflict that erupted earlier this month. My name is Ammara Durrani. I am Honorary Senior Fellow at the Jinnah Institute, hosting today's webinar from Islamabad. Our subject today is Fighting a Costly War, Economic Transition and Human Impact. The post-Pahalgam bilateral war theater is not insulated from the hyper-connected, already volatile global economic system of the 21st century. India and Pakistan are suppliers as well as purveyors of the global economy. Both countries have vastly different data sets on development economics and finance. Our webinar today will explore the new political economy of an old conflict that has blown hot and cold for nearly 80 years. Our eminent speakers today will provide insights on what may be the economic and human costs of a long war between India and Pakistan. Both countries are home to a combined 1.7 billion populations and a cumulative regional economy of $4.5 trillion. Let me quickly introduce our speakers for today. Dialing in from Washington, D.C. is Dr. Ishrat Husain, who's former governor of the State Bank of Pakistan, former dean of the prestigious business school IBA, where he remains professor emeritus, former advisor to the Prime Minister on institutional reforms and austerity in the government of Pakistan. Dr. Hussain is the recipient of the prestigious national award, the Nishan-e-Imtiaz, and he's a Woodrow Wilson scholar. He's the author of numerous books and monographs, including most recently, Development Pathways, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, from 1947 till 2022, and Pakistan, the Economy of the Elite State. Welcome, Dr. Ishrat Husain.
Thank you very much.
Joining us from Karachi is the famous Khurram Husain, one of Pakistan's leading business and economic journalists, and also Dawn's preeminent columnist. He is also a Woodrow Wilson scholar, has worked with the BBC, and taught at prestigious business education institutions, including LUMS. Welcome, Khurram.
Thank you.
Ishrat Saab, let me start with you with a focus on India and its economy first. India is now the world's fourth largest economy. It has surpassed Japan. Estimated economy size of $4 trillion. Average growth rate is 6%. In this fight with India, with Pakistan, India seems to be the proverbial Goliath against a smaller Pakistan. There seems to be a very quiet, understated international analytical consensus that India may be able to foot a long war bill without much pain to its growth and development. Do you agree?
Well, I have to relate it to the ambition of India as far as their both economic as well as political power is concerned. By 2047, they want to become a developed country, which means that their GDP would be somewhere between 30 to 40 trillion dollars. And that means that they will have to have a consistent growth rate of 7 to 8% per annum in order to achieve this. If that is their ambition and they want to become the member of the Security Council, they want to become a regional power, they want to be set up against China, then you have to relate it to their ambitions, not what their current situation is. And any disruption, economic or social, which creates problems for the Indian economy in terms of its growth rate, that I think is something we have to consider. My analysis, which appeared in Dawn a few weeks ago, shows that there are 6 different channels through which the Indian economy is going to be affected adversely. Number one is the financial markets. They already showed that even after these 3 days, there was an exodus of almost $83 billion from the markets, because the markets do react very sharply, although they come back. But if this is a pause and there is a possibility that this war will be consumed, I think the markets will remain jittery. Second was on the tourism. Now, we have always seen that whenever there is a conflict in any country, the tourists start avoiding that particular country. Therefore, your earnings, which India is a major recipient of the tourist earnings, also goes down. Then they have this global capability centers where 150 multinational corporations have formed their second home in India after the United States and Europe. And these are both creating jobs as well as they are also contributing to the exports of the Indian IT industry. And if this happens, then there is a possibility that a lot of multinationals would either wrap up or they will move, or the newcomers will not come in. The fourth is FDI. The FDI is also very sensitive. They want a peace, they want a complete a calmness as far as the political situation is concerned. And if they are scared, then they are not going to bring in their investment. And we saw that in 2002 when a lot of multinational corporations approached the prime minister and said, look, we came here because we thought you will have stability, but now that you have confrontation with India, we do not think we want to do business with you. The fifth one is the defense expenditure. India is still one of the largest provider of social protection. 800 million people are being given ration in form of grains and pulses, and that is a very large sum in addition to others like the unemployment program support. And that I think will have to be diverted. They already spend about 78 to 80 billion on defense, and this episode might force, and it is actually forcing a lot of people to say that we should upgrade our Air Force capabilities in order to give a resounding answer to Pakistan. So there is a possibility that there may be more diversion of budgetary resources towards the defense expenditure. And finally is the Indus Water Treaty. Now, Indus Water Treaty is going to create a serious problems for Pakistan, and therefore the prestige of India as far as the humanitarian aid is concerned will also be at stake because this is going to create another crisis as far humanitarian crisis if there is a possibility of diversion of water or disruption of water flows to Pakistan. So for all these six items, my conclusion was that India has much to lose by a continued uncertain world where the confrontation with Pakistan continues. So it is in the interest of India to have very peaceful, neighborly relations with all the countries in South Asia, and that is going to be helpful to India in achieving its ambition to become a developed country by 2047.
Thank you, Dr. Ishrat. That's an excellent mapping of what India has to lose, especially when it comes to its projection of the shining India brand, the markets, the tourism sector, the tech sector. We're already looking at President Trump announcing and, telling Apple not to look at India as a supply chain alternative vis-a-vis China and to shift its business back from India. And then, more importantly, this last point that you highlighted, the India's defense expenditure versus its social sector spending, this one gets very little attention when it comes to analysis. I think this also has a lot of scope and impact on what the World Bank is recently projecting about India's ability to lift millions of people out of poverty, and India projecting it as a very big development achievement. So that is something that you've rightly pointed out. Khurram, let me come to you with a focused question comparatively on Pakistan. Um, Pakistan's economy is much smaller compared to India, 335 billion in size. Sluggish growth averaging between 1.5 to max. It's currently on its 25th IMF loan program. You've written extensively about it. External debt and liabilities crossing $130 billion, 35% of its GDP. And when the May conflict was happening earlier this month, the credit rating agency Modi was less worried about India. It was more worried about Pakistan. It even issued a negative advisory about the country's fragility to endure the costs of this conflict. Can Pakistan afford a long war with India, given its debt ridden economy? And who will pay for it?
But the short answer is no. Pakistan can't afford a long war. Part of that depends on what we mean by a long war. I mean, I'm assuming you mean something that lasts at least a fortnight, if not longer, and uses a substantial um, amount of the conventional capability that both countries have. So, I mean, if we're talking about a full scale land mobilization in addition to air and naval as well, across a broad front, wars like that tend to be more expensive than people bargain for. And the costs mount up very very fast. I think in Pakistan's case, it's widely understood that more than 2 weeks will become very difficult for Pakistan to sustain, for the simple reason that replenishing the inventories that have been depleted and replenishing fuel stocks will become very very urgent after a certain time. So, and if you ask who will pay for it, Amara, ultimately it's always the people that pay for these. I mean, you know, to some extent, Pakistan does have bilateral partners that may or may not, step forward to help replenish some inventories and whatnot. But who will pay for it means, I assume, also who will pay for the costs of the reconstruction afterwards and all that. There's not going to be much bilateral or multilateral help in order to do that. That will be done with money that will have to be generated from within Pakistan and from within on Pakistan's economy. The costs will be substantial of both the war fighting as well as managing the aftermath. And it will be very difficult for Pakistan to sustain such a thing. I think this is what, and they know this, by the way. And I think this is one of the reasons why they have invested very heavily in ensuring really effective short war or standoff capabilities, so they can bring hostilities to an end early and prevent it from getting dragged out, which is a viable military strategy for a country like Pakistan to follow. A country that knows that it cannot sustain long-term hostilities, so invests in bringing hostilities to a close very early in the engagements. Amara?
Khurram, thank you. I detect very strong pessimism in your response about Pakistan's absorption capacity, financial terms, for a more protracted conflict. Let me be a little more provocative here. When we look at the headline news, including from your newspaper, Dawn, it projects a very strangely different picture of two countries which seem to be having a handle on their economies, as well as being very in the game, all powerful militaries at it. I want to bring in the parallel of the Ukraine war, which is still ongoing. It started in 2022. The kind of global economic shocks it has sent across the world, global inflation, fuel, energy, food, supply chains. Now, compared to the Ukraine war and how it has impacted, global economy, the India-Pakistan war, to me, it seems it's able to project itself as being contained, causing very minimal ripple effects on the regional or global economy. In fact, in May this month, what we saw basically was a roadshow, a fashion a catwalk of global military industrial complex. The latest products, gadgets, they were being demoed in real time on display in social media. The stock price performance of French Rafale jets and Israeli drones and Chinese JF-17 Thunder jets. And then the news this week is Azerbaijan is going to buy those India-Pakistan jets at the cost of $1.6 billion. So what's here? It seems a very profitable war business, ostensibly, for the two countries, as well as regional clients, international suppliers. There's a whole, it seems to me, there may be a whole new fifth generation value chain. Now, what Ishrat Saab has said and what you are also sounding, what are the big trade offs here? What is missing here?
Well,
Khurram.
what's missing is the dollars with which to pay for all this. And the big trade off is the oldest trade off that we are taught in any introduction to economics course, which is guns versus butter. When you have limited resources with which to finance your own investment and your own growth, now a greater proportion of that resource is going to have to be committed to what are effectively non-productive capital investments like weapons. Um, and Pakistan has a defense industry. It's very small, and especially not highly developed in terms of the kind of capabilities that they now have to invest in, such as they're looking at the J-35 stealth fighter and whatnot. Those are not indigenously made or even assembled. I think looking at the growth impact of these of the war for either one of the two countries is not the right place to be looking. You use the example of the Ukraine war, and I think that's a very good example of a country that has fought a highly kinetic military campaign, a war over a broad front against a much larger power, but has fought it entirely with the help of bilateral partners. It is they who have paid for it. It is they who have supplied the material with which the fighting has been done. That is not going to be the case with Pakistan. And again, your own question contains the answer to why, because Pakistan does not have the kind of global stakes at play that Ukraine has. By Ukraine, by virtue of just being in Europe and by virtue of fighting the Russians, who both the Europeans and the Americans regard as a hostile menace to Western Europe or a strategic area. Pakistan has none of that. So we will have to fight the conflict, and there will most likely be more fighting after the 4 days that we just saw. It might be a year, it might be two before it resumes. But we will have to fight that with our own resources. And to some extent, maybe some bilateral help from China, for sure. But I think certainly nothing comparable to the sort that Ukraine received. Um, and I think for that reason, finding itself in a long, sprawling, and highly kinetic fighting of the sort that we've had in Ukraine is not something that Pakistan will ever seek. Um, and I mean, I hope that answers your question. That there are no global stakes at play here, and whatever we have to do to arrange for our own defense requirements has to come from our own resources, and that does place a burden. Pakistan can barely afford its own economic growth. Its national defense and national security is a burden on its limited resource envelope. And now that's going to weigh a lot more going forward at a time when the economy is already moribund. The economic challenges are considerable going forward. Of course, that doesn't mean they should not be met, and that doesn't mean that they cannot be met. They can, but it will require mind. It will require energetic commitment to reforms of the sorts that Ishrat Saab can tell us more about as
Yeah.
well. Um,
That
and all
that
those
that
things.
bring that gives us, Khurram, thank you. That gives us, you are consistently maintaining a very clear cold picture, and that gives me the segue to come to Ishrat Saab. So Ishrat Saab, in the context of what Khurram says, that ultimately Pakistan will need to use its own resources to fight a war, regardless of China, etc. Uh, this is the budget season for Pakistan, also for India. We are already seeing indicators, statements coming out that there will be a hike in defense expenditures for both the countries. India's defense budget in 2024-2025 was $86 billion. Pakistan's was $10 billion. India spends annually $3 billion on its nuclear program. Pakistan spends an annual $1 billion on its nuclear program. With the budget season, how are you viewing Pakistan's trajectory vis-a-vis balancing the new strategic calculus, the threat complex with India, and its own growth and debt targets? Over to you, Ishrat Saab.
Well, I think your question is based on the assumption that we have no other alternative but to continue with this kinetic action on both sides. That is what the underlying assumption is. My feeling is that we have to look at scenario analysis from the international point of view. The fact that the United States stepped in and India did not get that much support from international partners of theirs in this war was because people are scared of the two nuclear powers coming to confrontation. And I think you should continue to emphasize this point that two nuclear powers cannot continue in this confrontational mode for all the times to come in. So my assumption is that one scenario is that external pressure will keep these two countries off this particular course. And therefore, they will try to bring in some semblance of sanity among the leadership of the two countries, which appears quite remote at this point of time. But you're looking for the future, and the future really does not depend only on the past, but also on what the present situation is. And India was very, very aggrieved, I would say, that while China, Turkey, Azerbaijan, and many other countries came to Pakistan's support explicitly and implicitly, India didn't get support from anywhere except, Israel. And that to me is something which the leadership in India will have to consider. The second scenario is that there is some sort of resumption of the dialogue between these two countries, which is used to be, composite dialogue, where some of the irritants can be removed, and then you build up the confidence measures in order to smooth the relations and build up the relations. That is another scenario which is quite possible. But as I said, the kind of jingoism which is prevailing right now doesn't give very much hope that this scenario will come in. Thirdly, as far as Pakistan is concerned, it is, as the foreign observers I have followed have said very clearly, that it was not only the jets and the radars and the missiles which China provided, but how Pakistan was able to use that for the linkages of all the devices as well as the maneuverability. While they were being attacked, they were being also very smart in trying to unlock themselves and avoid the missile attacks. So the human angle in Pakistan, as far as the air force is concerned, is now being recognized that it was not only the superiority of the J-10 or PL-15, but also the way the Pakistanis did come across in their combat with India. Now, it also gives some food for thought that our air defense system was not able to contain the missile attacks on Nur Khan base or on Bolari or on Jacobabad or Sargoda. So we have to look at some expenditures at least as far as our air defense system is concerned, because S-400 is much superior than what we have right now. So there will be some increase in our defense expenditure as far as the air defense system is concerned in the budget. So that is what I call as a mid-course scenario at this moment, that in our budget this year, we would have some increase in the defense expenditure. But Ammara, you know, and Khurram knows, we are spending $3 billion on maintaining a redundant, you know, workforce where 50% of workforce, it's only the federal government, are in non-productive jobs. Then we have cars and the telephones and all the paraphernalia, which leads to another $3 billion of government expenditure. And if you go to the provinces, which are spending even more than $3 billion, so there is a scope for saving from the expenditure just on the non-productive government apparatus, and you can use that in order to support your defense. So we have the means, whether there is the willingness to do it. And after the war with India, there is a unity in the government and in the country, and there is not so much, I don't think there's so much resistance if tough decisions are taken right now in the name of solidifying our defenses against a major, power next door to us, and people would be willing to, I think, go along with it rather than resist. This is the opportunity. This is the time. There's no other better time than this one in order to bring about the kind of reforms we've been talking about for umpteen years. So the savings from there should be able to boost up our defense expenditure.
Ishrat Saab, I have a quick follow-up question, which is actually tied to my final question set for both of you. You're specifically focusing on the fiscal side of Pakistan, especially the human agency part. Very, very important. Um, this brings me to the question of the role of international financial institutions. You and Khurram both have identified the growing role of IFIs and the markets as pressure points. Traditionally, this conflict between India and Pakistan has been mediated by third party countries. Ishasab, you mentioned the US stepping in, diffusing the crisis. That has been the historical trajectory. But at the same time, we also saw unprecedented policy statements by the leadership of the World Bank vis-a-vis the status of the Indus Water Treaty. We saw official statements from IMF vis-a-vis India's pressure on Pakistan's current IMF program. And then we are aware of how the upcoming budget in Pakistan is very heavily influenced by the IMF program. We have the fiscal pact between the federal government and the provinces. My question is, in your view, Ishit Saab, and I'll come to Khurram also in a second, in your view, what's the new economic model? Because you earlier talked about the need for new scenarios, new economic model scenarios. In a new scenario, do international financial institutions, the IFIs, the IMFs, and the World Banks and the ADBs of the world, do they have bigger sticks to pressure countries like Pakistan and India? And they also bring in the markets and the investors to come up with the stability solutions, not to rock the economic boat. Ishrat Saab.
Well, you must realize that even the international financial institutions are looking at their own allocation mechanism. For example, if you look at the 20-year, 20 billion country partnership between the World Bank and Pakistan, for the first time, there is no allocation at all for balance of payment support or for budgetary support. That is a big departure. What are the priorities, which we have been saying this for a long time? Out of school children, literacy poverty, stunting and nutrition for the younger children, all human centered. And that is what really the country needs. You don't have a switch on and switch off that you can actually say, now we can switch on and do very well, but you have to lay down the foundation for a strong human resource base in order to confront the challenge. Second is a climate risk. Although I'm not very optimistic after Mr. Trump's induction in office that the World Bank and ADB and even the other international institutions will pay much attention to climate change. But for us, the food, water, energy nexus is critical. We will not survive if we are not able to create the conditions where this nexus can either be retained or it can be augmented. So I think our model now is very different from going to the IMF and saying, give us the money for the balance of payment support, and it will open up the World Bank windows, ADB windows, and the bilateral windows. I think we have to start looking at our debt management strategy. Why can't we repay these short-term loans to China, Saudi Arabia, and UAE by increasing our exports and increasing remittances? This year, the remittances are $7 billion in 1 year, higher than the previous year. And the entire IMF program for 3.5 years is giving us $7 billion. So IMF program to me is more in order to induce us to do some reforms and to create macroeconomic balances and stability rather than the long-term, structural reforms. We have to carry out the long-term structural reforms in order to meet our ambitions. I did a calculation that in 2011, 2012, we had reached $25 billion of exports. If we had continued with the same growth rate, which was less than 10%, it was 6 to 7%, in 2024 25, 23 24, we would have reached $56 billion of exports if we had carried out. But what we did, we played with the exchange rate. We created a situation where we lost the reserves drastically in 4 years, and our exports actually started going back rather than increasing. So it is within our powers. We cannot be helpless and we cannot blame the IFIs for all the doings which we have done so far. If you had done ML1, which was being part of the CPAC, when your conditions were quite robust as far as 2015 was concerned, your fiscal deficits were lower and you were growing at a reasonably good rate, and China was willing to give you concessional loans. In 10 years, ML1 would have reduced the logistics costs of evacuation of exports and imports by one third. These are the calculations which have been done by the feasibility studies. So we have a lot of missed opportunities where we have not actually done good for the structural changes which the economy requires. And that is what I've been arguing, that unless you do that path, we are going to be stuck in this situation where we'll go again to the IMF and say, well, support us for the balance of payment.
Khurram, let me give the floor to you. So Ishrat Saab has, beautifully laid out the map of the development finance dynamics, which Pakistan is particularly currently, grappling with vis-a-vis the IFIs. So let me ask you this question. Do you think the IFIs have a potential role as peace brokers in some manner if we are to think of a new and innovative way of brokering peace in a non-traditional way, which is determined by economic and financial interests? Do you think IFIs have more skin in the game now in the region?
Um, Amara, I appreciate your question, but I don't think so because the IFIs may have some amount of clout over Pakistan, but they have little to no leverage over India. India does not borrow from them, and though there's not much that they can say to a country like India. Even in Pakistan, the IFIs don't really get into questions of security and defense. I mean, on deep background, there are conversations, and when the fiscal equation has to be studied to see how benchmarks or performance criteria are going to be met. They do look at defense allocations, but they have very limited leverage with which to tell Pakistan how much it can and cannot spend on defense. They can maintain a target in the overall thing, but if Pakistan shows corresponding cuts somewhere else and allocates towards defense instead, the IFIs aren't in a position to say no, that's unproductive expenditure, so don't spend over there. This is something that was discussed in the IFIs at a very high level back in the early 90s. I think there was a board meeting in the IMF in 92 where the question of getting involved in borrower countries' defense expenditures, for example, was explicitly discussed. There were two board meetings. And the conclusion they came to eventually was that this is not something the IMF is equipped to involve itself in. And the board directed the staff in a board decision, which is a public decision at that time, that you are not to get involved in these kind of in these decisions, except at a very high aggregated level. Just make sure that the overall fiscal equation, the overall forex inputs and outputs into the country's economy are by and large within program parameters. But beyond that, it's very difficult for them to do so. I think if we are to seek external um, involvement in Pakistan, it will have to go beyond the IFIs. This will have to be individual countries that will have to become involved. And countries from where a great deal of the foreign direct investment that comes into India, for example, will have to become involved. The United States, I mean, this particular fighting in this latest episode ended when the United States became involved. And I'm convinced that one of the reasons why it, in fact, got to where it was is because at the outset, we had a statement from J.D. Vance, the Vice President of the United States, saying, well, this is your war, it's got nothing to do with us. And that may well have been perceived in India as some kind of a carte blanche to go ahead and do whatever you wish. Until a few days later, they woke up and said, hang on a minute, this has gotten a bit out of hand. And then they came in and said, okay, cut this out. There's no substitute for that kind of bilateral or direct government involvement in South Asian affairs. Sad to say, I don't think anyone wants to see foreign intervention in your own country. But I think when you're talking about a small country or a country like Pakistan, which is a large country in its own way, but smaller than India, nonetheless. So relative to India, if you're looking at a small country, that is, let's face it, being bullied. And this is what was happening just now after Pahalgam. Then, I think asking and expecting and that the international community should play some kind of a role in bringing about a de-escalation is entirely called for. And that's where we're going to have to look. I think the IFIs are just going to be helpless bystanders in all this.
I really truly appreciate your frankness, Khurram. It really answers my question on the potential role or lack of the IFIs. But let me still very quickly press you then. So if it in the case of India, the IFIs may not have enough capital, even if they may have with Pakistan. What about the markets? I mean, you've categorically identified countries like China and the US, sure, but it's actually the markets which are the growth engines for both these countries. Do you see the markets you know, exerting any kind of pressure anytime soon on India for, peacetime business?
Indirectly, yes. The markets don't speak with the single voice anywhere, right? Unlike nation states, markets don't have a head as such to speak through. But markets speak through, the assessments, through credit rating assessments that are brought out, through industry associations that issue warnings. They speak through shipping industries or shipping companies that issue warnings. They speak through the pricing, warnings about going to floating to certain ports. So, for example, in the Kargil war, shipping companies had begun to attach a war risk surcharge on shipping coming into Pakistan, into Karachi port. And in 2002, Ishrat Saab has just given us the example of big American companies that went to the Indian government at the time and told them, look, we thought to invest in a stable country, but you seem to be getting sucked into a war here. We're going to have to reevaluate many of our investments. And that's what caused a rethink in India following the big buildup. So these are the ways in which the markets speak. And I think this sort of a voice, which is disaggregated, there's no one voice, but it's coming from various directions. Pricing of your bonds begins to blow out. India doesn't have any foreign bonds as such, not privately placed. So they don't have to worry too much about that. But they do have substantial FDI. India's seen more than $80 billion worth of foreign direct investment just in this fiscal year alone. And they would be very, very sensitive to what foreign investors tell them. And foreign investors are very, very sensitive to war risk in any country where they are acquiring substantial or lasting stakes. So yes, I think the markets will have a role to play, and they will play it in their own way. But it's very difficult to call on the markets at critical moments and say, "Hey, you need to come in and do something," because it's a disembodied, disaggregated entity, unlike nation states. But nation states can be called upon, and I think the last episode gives us an example of how quickly these kind of things can end when a big power like the United States takes it upon itself to say, cut that out. Amara?
Thank you, Khurram, for that excellent, really insightful reading of the capital markets and their role, even if it's kind of, not aggregate or more under the radar. Very, very useful. Isha Saab, I want to give you the last word. Building on what I think Khurram has very rightly pointed out, the very stark economic and financial differences between India and Pakistan. India doesn't have debt liabilities. Pakistan does. Pakistan is dependent on the IMF. Now, the Prime Minister has stated that Pakistan is ready to talk. And taking up your earlier point about this being an opportunity for Pakistan, maybe an economic opportunity for Pakistan. Very quickly, sir, what would be your bird's eye view of what Pakistan should take to the table of talks if and when they come in terms of its own economic interests
Yeah.
that are also balanced with the strategic and defense interests? You have the last word.
Well, thank you, Mara. As you remember, I was very much involved in the India Pakistan trade resumption. And during the PPP government, uh, they had made a lot of, you know, I would say, almost come to an agreement with the Congress government at that time to have both the resumption of SAFTA, where there would be only 5% tariff rate for goods, and they had also agreed to reduce the negative list and also allow some of the Pakistani, textiles and others which were not allowed to be entering the Indian markets within 12 months and there was an agreement signed between or agreement reached between Khurram Daskir, who had just come in as the commerce minister, and the Anand Sharma, who was the commerce minister. And Then Mr. Modi's emissary came to the Prime Minister and said, "Oh, this is an election year, and we would not like this agreement to be endorsed by the cabinet." The cabinet meeting was on 21st February to endorse this agreement. And when we come to power, we will continue to have this negotiation. That day and today, we have had no negotiation at all. So if we really want the economic welfare of both the countries and integration of South Asia, which has only 5% intra-regional trade as compared to 55 or 60% in East Asia, in ASEAN countries. No, that is a big opportunity for both India and Pakistan. India will have access to a much larger market. And I've talked to the foreign investors, and they said that there are comparative advantages in India and Pakistan and Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, which will be optimized if we have a South Asian Economic Union or something of that kind. So, this is what we should try to uh, take to the table, that let's start with the trade relations where we had left in 2014 and try to resume that and give vitality to SAFTA. And therefore, this will be in the interest of India, which is not very friendly today with neighborly countries. It doesn't have very good relations with Bangladesh, with Nepal, with Sri Lanka, with others. And this will be a win win situation for all South Asian countries and for India, because India will have access to a much larger market. When I went to Indian School of Business in Chandigarh, in Mohali, I met the Haryana, Delhi, Punjab, Chamber of Commerce, and they said, "Look, we don't have to send our goods to Delhi or Bombay or to Madras. We can send all that to Punjab, which is a much larger market, and we can procure a lot of, resources, intermediate goods and raw materials from Punjab, which will reduce our costs, both agriculture as well as the industry." So I personally am very great advocate. I've been disappointed with what has happened in the India-Pakistan trade relations and SAFTA, but I think this is something which is a win-win situation for all. And if the external players really want to keep these two countries from fighting and wasting their resources on war and skirmishes and have the tension in this region, I think this is an entry point which I would very much like to advocate.
Thank you, Isha Saab. Thank you very much, Khurram, for your excellent insights. I think this last point by Isha Saab, let's trade goods and services and let's not trade drones and missiles. If there has to be a better and more promising South Asia, if you want to actually see actual growth outcomes in both the countries, I am reminded of the fact that on the Human Development Index, India is ranking 130th out of 193 countries as a medium developed country, and Pakistan ranks 164th as a low developed country. India still has roughly 20% of its population living below the poverty line, and Pakistan's poverty rate has crossed 40% after the 2022 floods. What is clear is that if this conflict erupts again, if it is relatively protracted by weeks, by months, it is certain that both countries, India and Pakistan, and their investors will need to be prepared for another generation of lost growth and lagging human development. I hope our audiences have found our discussion today useful and thought provoking. I thank our speakers, Dr. Ishrat Husain and Khurram Husain, for their invaluable time and participation. In the coming weeks, Jin Institute will continue to spotlight the India Pakistan conflict in the context of new geo-economic and geopolitical realities. Stay tuned, and until next time, have a good day.